The following presentation is a production of Ride the Wave Media.
It's the Best Birth Podcast, where we interview experts that elevate you as you prepare your heart and mind to have the best birth.
Each episode will interview professionals so you are prepared for pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. Our experts will build your confidence and empower you to trust your intuition throughout your pregnancy.
This audio is taken from videos on YouTube. Watch the entire episodes on YouTube at Birth Made Mindful. You're listening to the Best Birth Podcast, and today we're here with Deb Flashenberg. She is a prenatal yoga instructor. She's certified in Lamaze and has so much to talk to us today. She's got spinning babies, and we're just going to have a great conversation today.
Deb Flashenberg is the founder and director of the Prenatal Yoga Center in New York City. Along with being a prenatal yoga teacher, she is also a labor support doula, Lamaze childbirth educator, mother of two, and self-proclaimed birth and anatomy geek. For the past 8 years, Deb has also greatly enjoyed being the host of the podcast Yoga Birth Babies, where she speaks with some of the world's leading experts in pregnancy, birth, breastfeeding, and parenthood. Most recently, Deb completed Dr. Sarah Duvall's Pregnancy and Postpartum Corrective Exercise Specialist Program and the Spinning Babies Parent Educator Certification. Welcome, Deb. So good to have you.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. Anytime I can talk about birth and yoga with other birth enthusiasts is just up my alley, so I'm really excited. Thank you.
And speaking of that, could you tell us a little bit about how you got into it and what made you interested in this field?
Sure, it's really quite accidental. So I was a musical theater performer for many years, and I started to get into yoga, and it started to be like, oh, should I go to a dance class or should I go to a yoga class? And in my brain, like, Deb, you should dance. And then I'm like, oh, I should go to yoga. So I kept falling into the yoga world. And then after doing a certification, I realized the style of yoga I just got certified in, it's a style called Bikram. This was 24 years ago, so it was a while ago. I didn't like it. I realized there was no opportunity for conversation to look at the student and think, what do you need today? It was like a big monologue. So my mom, who did marketing at the time, said, why don't you think about prenatal yoga? Because when people are pregnant, they're really going to put focus on themselves. And so at that time, I found a prenatal yoga teacher training. It was all the way out in Seattle. There was nothing in New York at the time, which is kind of surprising. And so I started that. But my big jump into being a birth advocate was when one of my students was doing her fellowship at one of the big teaching hospitals here in New York. And she invited me up. So it's totally illegal what she did, because she put me in scrubs and she told everyone as a med student. And so when I got a chance to see birth firsthand, I was honestly mortified by what I saw. This was about 2001. I could not believe how people were, in my opinion, how people were being treated. And there was one birth that was just really shocking. The parents didn't speak English. They just didn't seem respected. The baby wasn't brought to the parent after. It did not seem how I thought birth should be. So after that, I realized that up to that point, all I was doing is modifications for yoga for the pregnant body, but I wasn't actually teaching them anything about how to advocate for themselves, what their options were, more than just here are some poses that are good for you when you're pregnant. And so that's when I decided to become a doula, because I wanted to be more in what I call like the front line. And I could kind of pull the curtain back and say, all right, so here are things that you may see when your birth's unfolding. Here are some questions to ask. Here are things that can really help you be more comfortable. And then I became a Lamaze teacher, because at this point I was still in my late 20s and I was thinking, I'm not having kids anytime soon. And I wanted just to I'm still, I mean, many years later, I'm still hungry for information to better what I can do. In fact, I just signed up for another certification. My husband's like, seriously? Really? You're doing another? I'm like, I am. So that's how I stumbled into pretty much all of this, the doula work. I'm not an active doula anymore, but I still teach childbirth education, and I just got my spinning baby certification. Not that I'm actually teaching that as much as I incorporated all into my prenatal classes so that we can look at how do we balance the body and how can we work on coping skills. So I think all of that helps the students on the other side. So I'm not at the births anymore, but I'm hoping to be impacting the birth still.
I love that you're so hungry for that
So
information,
hungry.
wanting to just support and help them and stay current.
Oh,
That is one of the things that I've noticed being in the birth field is that certain practices are just outdated, and we need to make sure that the most current research is what is happening for all of our families.
I mean, that is a huge conversation. It sounds like what we're seeing in hospitals. I'm like, well, actually, evidence-based research says that's really outdated. But I look back to where my own knowledge was 20-ish years ago. And if I stayed with that and didn't add, I'd be doing a disservice to the students. Like my own understanding of pelvic floor health, I got a pelvic floor teacher training certification, but my own understanding wasn't what it is now, because back when I even had my son 13 years ago, I didn't even understand everything I understand now. And so I look at what I did to my own body that caused that birth to be so challenging. So I think it's important. It's a disservice to our students and our community if we, and again, this can lead into a conversation about hospital protocols, about if we don't allow ourselves to update with the latest information.
You mentioned with your education and with yoga, working with your clients to teach them more about how yoga helps in pregnancy instead of just, oh, here are some poses you can do.
Mhm.
Can you talk to a little bit about how yoga and meditation prepare us for birth?
Oh, gosh, there are so many ways. So the meditation, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that people, when they're in the throes of labor, are going to be like, like that's probably not going to happen. But it's a great way to look at how to focus the mind. It's a great way to connect to the breath and connect to the parasympathetic nervous system. We know that the physiology of birth is if you're in the fight or flight, when the adrenaline increases, the function of oxytocin decreases. So the breathing that we can do in meditation, and then we can take that awareness into the yoga poses. And so the way I like to use the yoga poses kind of three ways. So the first way is that we can just deal with the common aches and pains, like how many pregnant people like my back hurts, my neck hurts, my shoulders hurt. So there's yoga poses that can deal with that. Then we can use the yoga poses along with a lot of the breathing that we've learned, and not like the old fashioned, like Lamaze doesn't do that anymore. I don't do that. It's really about connecting to the breath to help calm the body. We can apply that into the yoga poses that have more discomfort. So it's one thing in a childbirth ed class to be like, oh, you may want to try mantras. You may want to try counting your breath. You may want to try visualization. And everyone's like taking notes. Like, yeah, I'm going to try that. But can we then take those thoughts and theories and apply it when actually uncomfortable? That's what I love about marrying the childbirth ed and the yoga and the meditation. So we can hold a warrior two or utkatasana, or there's a pose I called screaming toe, which you're really stretching out your feet. There's another pose I created called the mock contraction. It's really just a 60-second wall squat, but we can use the yoga poses and embrace the challenge. Some of them are endurance of like the muscles working, and then some of them are stretching, but we can be safely uncomfortable in a controlled situation, and then apply all these tools so that when they're actually in labor, they're not shocked and be like, how do I get here if I'm uncomfortable? We've already practiced discomfort. And I'm going to be honest, I've given birth twice. I've watched over 100 births, holding warrior two. It's not the same, the contraction, but we can start to raise our threshold of reaction to discomfort. So that's where I think we can include the yoga. And then my final part of how we use the yoga to prep for labor and birth, it really comes from a lot of my spinning babies awareness. So if there is internal imbalance, if we don't have baby well aligned, that's where things can stall out. So can we look at habits we do in our body, always crossing the same leg, always carrying your bag on the same shoulder, and then think, okay, that psoas might be tighter. Or if someone's a tail tucker, all right, the posterior part of your pelvic floor might be tighter. So how can we balance the bony structure and the pelvic floor and the soft tissue so that as baby descends and rotates, they're not hitting resistance, which can create maybe the baby's chin's moving away from its chest, maybe the head's now going to its shoulder, and all that misalignment of baby and pelvis, that can stall labor and that can make things really dysfunctional and that can add to more interventions. So we can use so much of the yoga practice more than just here's some poses, but to really set the way for hopefully a more functional birth.
Would you say that most of that takes place in preparation, like the last few weeks of pregnancy, or are you actually doing a lot of these movements during labor?
No, you're probably not doing a lot of story. I mean, some of them you might. I'm not teaching the spinning babies like forward leaning inversion in the prenatal class just because we don't have, the height to do so. But I am teaching certain ways to teach how to relax the psoas muscle. So a lot of it's preparation, but then the coping skills can go right into labor. And then, but we do things like we're getting on all fours, we're rocking the hips. I'm teaching them about the different levels of the pelvis, so they know external rotation is going to open the pelvic inlet. I teach about like an asymmetrical lunge. We know it's going to open up the mid pelvis. We look at internal rotation that opens up the outlet. So while I can't teach certain parts of spinning babies, because we don't have the space, I do teach a lot of the principles that can go into labor.
And I feel like you need to tell us more about spinning babies. Most of our listeners probably have never heard the term. I didn't know anything about it with my first pregnancy, but found it as I was preparing for a VBAC for my second.
Okay, so I actually don't know when spinning babies originated, but Gail Tully is the founder of it. I've actually had the honor of having her on my podcast, I think 3 times. And I did the training and she was part of that. So she's amazing. So she was a midwife, and some of the theories came from another midwife, and then Gail kind of married it all together. So the idea is that if we use gravity, internal balance of the pelvis and the soft tissue, and baby alignment and movement, that can help the baby's journey through the pelvis without interruption, without, oh, there's tension here in the pelvis and then the baby's going to be affected. So she believes how we create movement, how we use gravity, and how the baby aligns can lead to a more functional birth. So that's
incredible. Yes. Also, you mentioned with your classes, how does that provide connection for humans? We're wired for connection. And so do you find that your classes provide a support community in the perinatal state?
We do, because we do something a little bit unusual that it's funny when we have brand new yoga students come and then they eventually graduate on, they'll come back like, oh, they didn't ask anything about me. So we start this thing called circle time. And even when it's a path class, we still do circle time. So circle time allows us to connect to each other and the students to each other, and also tell me what I need to do for that class. So the students will go around, I'll call on everyone. Even when we do it online, we're still doing it. Even in hybrid, I'm like holding the iPad so the people at home can see the people in studio. So they're going to say their name, how far along they are, and then any aches, pains, or issues or requests. So that way I can tailor the class to what's going on. So if I planned a big shoulder opening, but the whole class is like, actually, my lower back hurt, I need to shift my gear because it's not about me, it's about what they want. But what's really fun is the students get to know each other's names. And then they also know what week they are. Oh, you're a 38 week. Me too. Where are you delivering? Who's your doctor? Oh, let's meet up after we bring our babies for walks. So they get to know each other differently than if you just set a mat next to one another and just kind of start class. They also give, I have to rein it in sometimes, but sometimes they give feedback. They're like, oh yeah, like right now in New York, it is hot. And we've been talking about swelling and all that. So one person's like, I just got compression hose and I got too many. Who wants my compression hose? So they'll share with each other. So it's really sweet that by just introducing yourself and saying where you are in your pregnancy, it creates an opportunity for connection and friendship. And even through COVID, when we were doing everything online, people still asked about each other. They're like, oh, did so-and-so have her baby? And then in the chat, they're connecting. So I think just introducing yourself is nice because a lot of pregnant folks, not just pregnant folks, but we want community. And if you're not going through pregnancy with a friend, it can feel pretty isolating. So that's one reason I started that, just to open up and connect.
Yoga is an individual practice, but having that sense of community, knowing that everybody's in it together and also supporting each other, that's such a beautiful community you've created.
It's also fun when they connect and then they share their outcome. Like we just had a student who had been coming for about 2 months. And she was in class. She's like, oh, I'm feeling kind of crampy. I'm like, well, that's a good thing. And then a few days later, another student's like, Hannah had her baby. She pushed for 13 minutes. I mean, first time. That's pretty amazing. And so then other people get excited about that. And also on my podcast, we do community birth stories. So I invite the students to share their stories so that they can also, the community can hear the outcome.
With Lamaze, you mentioned that it has changed. Can you walk us through the changes of what Lamaze looks like now?
Yeah, so I don't actually know how it originally started. Like I never looked into like the huge history, but I know just from anecdotally, everyone's like, it's about which luckily when I started, I think I got my Lamaze certification, it might have been like 2000, somewhere between 2004, 2006. I started my studio in 2002, so it kind of probably aligns in there. It never had anything to do with that funky breathing. What was introduced to me and what it's still about is evidence-based research. They're very much about creating support and confidence. And they base it on their I took notes for this, 6 healthy birth practices, because I don't have these memorized. So again, it goes away from theory that the partner's like leading you through any sorts of breathing, like or whatever it was, and back to evidence-based. And their 3 healthy care practices are: let labor begin on its own, walk, move around, and change positions through labor, bring a loved one, friend, or doula for continuous support, avoid interventions that are not medically necessary, avoid giving birth on your back, and follow your body's urge to push, and keep the mother or parent with baby together because it's best for the mother, baby, and breastfeeding. So when you look at that and think, that makes total sense. So what I love about Lamaze is they don't seem to have any sort of agenda. They're not touting themselves that we've created a certain methodology and ours is the best. What I feel like they're just saying, how can we look at the evidence-based information, offer support, offer confidence, encourage communication between the pregnant person and their provider, and advocate for yourself, because that's what can lead to a less traumatic birth. Because when we look at the level of birth trauma that happens, it's enormous. I did a blog on this a few years ago, and the amount of people that say they felt traumatized from their birth, it was like 30%. That is pretty crazy when we think about that. And it could be how they're made to feel. Someone dismisses them. Their voice wasn't being heard. They weren't even called by their name. They was being called like mommy, or maybe it was greater. They felt interventions were given to them that weren't necessary. They weren't involved in the conversation about those interventions. So if we think about that, Lamaze is just saying, let's look at the best practice for birth and let's advocate for that. Let's give you the education. We're hoping that can help ease those numbers. So that's really why I've stuck with the Lamaze. I just really like their philosophy.
Education is that piece that we're all looking for so that we feel prepared and maybe even a little sense of control for an event that often we don't have much control over.
Yeah. And that's what I think is really important. If you can recognize that you've got or at least the team around you that you're confident in, and they've heard your wishes, then you can soften the grip of control and recognize that you've placed yourself in the hands of those that you believe in, not just like aimlessly, like, sure, take it, but that you've had that conversation of like, here's some of my birth preferences. Here's what I've learned. Here's what's important to me. Here's my priorities. And I'm going to ask my team to really stand by me and help advocate, because we don't want the person in labor to have to be thinking about that. That's going to put them in that front of the mind, that front cortex. And then they're going to be not in like that labor land. So if they can do their education, get their team on board, share their preferences, then they can let that control go, because we can't, I'm a control freak. If I could control things, I would. But labor is one of those things that we have to ride the wild river.
Yeah, riding the wild river, but having a little bit of an idea of how that's going to look, where that river is going to take you, so that it's not, like the day of your labor is the first time you've ever stepped foot in that river.
Right. Yes. That's why you've already like set the bumpers up for the river. Like you've got the support people knowing what's important to you. You've educated yourself. You're not just flinging yourself in the river hoping, not knowing where the river's going, not knowing how deep the river is, but having studied what the river is. So yeah, we get the education, we get the support, and then we can soften our grip.
That's beautiful. I love how you brought in Lamaze and how it was all encompassing. And that's really our mission with this podcast, is to find the best birth for you, regardless of what that looks like, and just having that education to support that. What other pieces of advice do you have for women as far as pain techniques during labor or other ways to prepare for labor?
Definitely explore all your pain options. And what I also tell my students is don't assume that you have only one. So we know that the national average of using an epidural is pretty high. And I try to remind my students that you can't rely only on that. So that's why when I see students, when I talk about pain skills and coping skills, I see some of them kind of like smug and roll their eyes. I'm like, okay, so the reason we need to practice for a physiological birth is because we don't know how things are going to unfold. If we can prepare ourselves, you might have a really fast labor and not have a chance for medication that you might plan on. You might have a epidural that doesn't quite work. We know about 10% of epidurals don't work. So the more we can dive into preparing ourselves, I think the more we're going to be open for what does happen. So look at all the different coping skills. Look at all the different options of, do you want massage? Do you like mantras? Do you focus better when your eyes are closed? Do you focus better on an object? Get your partner as involved, or team. If you're not partnered, maybe your doula, as involved as possible so they know what resonates with you, and practice. I think practice makes progress. So that's why we do this stuff in our classes, like the challenging poses. You can do something else. I know, like in Lamaze, they have the 1-minute ice cube test where you're holding a cube of ice for a minute, which is uncomfortable. And then I like to bring the partner into that. So the partner can see if you're uncomfortable, what does that look like? Do you tend to tighten your shoulders when you're uncomfortable? Do you tighten your jaw? Are you holding your breath? So practicing, they see that, okay, my shoulders are tight. Remind me to relax my shoulders. Or they might notice that you get really tight here, or you squeeze everything, or you don't breathe. So they can see your pattern and they can start to recognize that that's what you may want in labor, but have a lot of options. I remember doing a birth where my client was like, I love massage. I'm going to want touch. And I was so ready. I'm like, you got it. And all she wanted to do was straddle the toilet and face the wall. And I was on one side and her husband was on the other side. And she didn't want anyone to talk to her or touch her. She just wanted us there. So I guess also another tip would be flexibility, not of the body necessarily, but of the mind. Kind of be open for what you need in the moment, and then as best you can ask for it. I don't know if that answers your question.
And even birth to birth, sometimes your preferences can change or how something is feeling. I remember using a TENS unit for the birth of my second son and really relying upon that. He was in a posterior position, so I was experiencing a lot of that feeling in my back. For the birth of my third son, I put it on and immediately knew, like, that's not what I want. Like, this TENS unit is not putting me in the right spot. And so I relied on different methods. But if you don't know those options, if they're not something you can grab at that moment, and you thought, oh, I'm just going to do massage, or I'm just going to do,
An epidural.
an epidural, and then something, needs to shift, having all of those available to you is really, really helpful.
Yeah, for my first son, my first child, a boy and a girl, my first child, I thought the birth tub was going to be like the be all. I got in, I hated it. And everyone kept trying to get me in, and I hated it. But for my second, like, they had to peel me out of the shower. What's the water? So even same body, but different experience.
I love that experience that you shared about the woman that just wanted to be facing the wall with the toilet. Do you have a favorite stage of labor, or are there any other experiences you can remember when you attended births?
It's so cruel, but I really like transition. So it's so awful to say that. When I labored, I did not have the same love for transition, because it's hard, but there's something kind of exciting about it. Like, we're at that final turn of labor. It's just so present. it just is, everything is in the moment. I'm so focused on the client and their needs. And it's such a back and forth, like giving them space, but also being there for them and watching and listening. I remember having a client tie her shoes because she's like, I'm done. I'm going home. And then I'm like, oh, we need to stay. I'm so sorry. Um, yeah, transition's really exciting.
Would you say that transition is that moment where every individual says, like, I don't want to be here anymore?
Oh, absolutely. I've given up. I'm done. I mean, I remember saying, I had home births. I remember saying to my midwife, I'm like, I think we should go to the hospital. I think I'm done. She's like, it's just so kind. Her name was Daisy. She was so kind. She's like, I hear you. What do you think's going to happen at the hospital that's different than here? And I'm like, they're just going to take the baby out. And she's like, no, they're not. I just turned around and like, how my husband's like, you were so pouty. I just walked back into my room and started crying. But it's that point. It's like, they call it hitting that wall or that crisis of confidence. Like, I can't do it. I don't want to do it. I give up. This is too much. And if the team knows the signs of labor, instead of being panicked that, oh my gosh, so-and-so's giving up, they can't do it. You can actually be like, oh, no, this is a really good sign. It actually is telling us we are so close. So that's why I like transition.
I remember that phrase, the only way out is through.
Yep.
And so when it comes to actually having your baby and delivering through your pelvis and having them come out, and even though it is a challenge and there's so much emotionally that is taking place of your confidence, knowing if you can do it, how long it's going to take. A lot of times in those last stages, you just don't know if you have the strength. And remembering that momentarily your baby is going to be placed in your arms, your hormones are going to react in a way that will provide that relief that you need, and looking forward to that moment instead of kind of sitting with where you're at currently. That can be a really helpful strategy.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love that.
Well, this has been such an exciting conversation with all of the different elements that you bring into your birth education. And like you mentioned, you also have a lot of different certifications. Do you feel like there are certain places that like every pregnant person has to look into when it comes to our preparation?
I mean, self-serving, but I think they should do yoga. I think they should check out Prenatal Yoga Center. But I think the most important thing they can do for them is to feel that they're aligned with the team. So the first place they should look at in preparation is look back at who they've assembled. So the first step is to think, what do I really want? And who am I in this birth scenario? So if they're a low risk person, are they with a high risk practice? So they need to look back at themselves first. What do I want out of this? And then look at the practice, and then start to look at the support they can find to bring in. So clearly, I think prenatal yoga is helpful, definitely spinning babies. I'm also a fan of chiropractic work if someone knows how to do the Webster technique, and if they can work with a pelvic floor physical therapist. I think that'd be really helpful too.
Fabulous. We've had so many of those guests on our podcast as well. We share a Mom Squad secret every week, and this one is by Danny. She says, contractions are not stronger than you can manage because they are you. That's how strong you are. Don't try to resist your strength. Embrace it and try to feel exactly where it's centered from. That will help contractions be the most effective. Create a birth environment that is quiet, dark, and utilizes water, if that's your preference.
That is beautiful. Oh, I love that.
Well, do you have any other resources, books, or experts that you would like to share with our listeners today?
Oh, definitely. All right. So I would say check out Spinning Babies. One of my favorite books that we actually include in our prenatal teacher training is Transformed by Birth by Britta Bushnell. I love her book. I'm also fortunate enough to be friends with her, so she's wonderful. But her book is really, really meaningful. So I have that at our studio. We have a lending library. I think I have like 3 copies. So definitely check that out. And then, yeah, get your body moving. I think that's probably the best thing you can do.
Oh, movement, it just feels good. It helps the labor process go smoothly. That's great advice. I wanted to share a quote from the book Natural Childbirth, The Bradley Way. And Susan says, birth is not only about making babies, birth is about making mothers. Strong, competent, capable mothers who trust themselves and know their inner strength.
That is wonderful.
You have definitely shared with us today how all of this preparation can help us to increase our confidence, to know of our inner strength. We thank you so much for your time today, Deb.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure.
I know this will be so helpful in moms preparing their hearts and minds for their best birth. Thanks for joining us on today's episode. We hope you've been elevated and inspired by this week's expert.
Subscribe today so you never miss an episode. And please share our podcast or post on your social media so that other moms and dads-to-be can also have the best birth.
Please note that the information provided is based on the expert's insights and personal experience. It is not intended as medical guidance. Please seek the advice of your medical provider as it applies to your specific condition.